What would you do if you saw a young public figure make an unbelievable act of kindness? On a routine flight, Barron Trump did something that left passengers in awe. He gave up his first-class seat for a veteran. But what happened next was beyond anyone's expectations. This incredible moment of generosity sparked a chain reaction that no one saw coming. The atmosphere inside Flight 247 crackled with the usual pre-flight energy. Passengers shuffled down the narrow aisle, their faces a mix of anticipation and exhaustion. Some adjusted their seats, others exchanged brief pleasantries with their neighbors. None had any idea that the next few moments would leave them breathless. In the first-class section, Barron Trump sat quietly by the window, his tall frame making him an imposing figure. He flipped through the pages of a hardcover book, seemingly absorbed, yet aware of the glances thrown his way. Unlike others in his family, he had no interest in the spotlight. But with a last name like his, attention was inevitable. Meanwhile, in the economy section, an elderly veteran walked slowly down the aisle, gripping the handle of a weathered leather duffel bag. His steps were measured, his back slightly hunched, but draped over his shoulders was a military jacket adorned with faded patches and worn-out medals, a testament to years of service and sacrifice. As he passed by, many passengers took notice, whispering among themselves. Some showed quiet respect, while others were simply curious about the story behind those old insignias. Finally, the veteran reached his seat, a cramped middle spot, wedged between a busy businessman and a restless toddler. He didn't complain, simply gripping the strap of his bag, his gaze distant. But something wasn't right. The moment he sat down, his shoulders tensed, his breathing became uneven. A nearby flight attendant quickly noticed the tension on his face. She stepped forward, crouching slightly beside him, her voice gentle. "Sir, are you all right?" she asked. The veteran hesitated, then exhaled sharply. I think I need a different seat," he admitted, his voice hoarse but firm. The businessman beside him frowned, visibly irritated. "The plane is full. We all have our assigned seats," he muttered, barely looking up from his laptop. A few passengers turned to look, curious about the minor commotion. None of them realized that, in first class, Barron Trump was watching everything unfold. Barron closed his book, his eyes fixed on the elderly man. There was something about the way he sat stiffly, the restrained discomfort in his expression. That didn't sit right. He furrowed his brows, thinking for a moment before making a decision. Without hesitation, he pressed the call button. A flight attendant arrived quickly, her professional demeanor tinged with curiosity. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked. Barron looked up, his tone calm yet firm. "Can I switch seats with the gentleman in the military jacket?" The air around them shifted subtly. The flight attendant blinked, momentarily stunned. Passengers in first class, who had been pretending not to listen, now openly turned their attention to the young Trump. "You want to switch seats?" she repeated, as if needing to confirm what she had just heard. "Yes," Barron nodded, his expression unwavering. A well-dressed woman seated across from Barron leaned in, curiosity lacing her voice. "You don't have to do that," she remarked. "This seat isn't cheap." Barron shrugged slightly, offering a small smile. "Some people deserve it more." The flight attendant nodded, then quickly made her way to the back of the plane. As Barron stood, gathering his belongings, the murmurs in first class grew louder. Some passengers exchanged surprised glances, while others whispered in hushed voices. It wasn't every day that someone, especially someone with his last name, voluntarily gave up such a privilege. A moment later, the flight attendant returned, her voice tinged with emotion. "He said he'd be happy to switch," she announced. Barron gave a polite nod, picked up his bag, and started down the aisle. Eyes followed him, a few passengers subtly reaching for their phones to capture the moment. When he reached the veterans' row, the elderly man looked up bewildered. His brows furrowed, processing the sight of the tall teenager standing before him. "Are you sure, young man?" he asked, his voice weathered but steady. "You don't have to do this for me." "I want to," Barron responded without hesitation, extending his hand. "Thank you for your service. Please take my seat." The veteran hesitated, as if struggling with the weight of the gesture, but the sincerity in Barron's eyes left no room for doubt. Slowly, he stood, gripping Barron's hand firmly, his weathered fingers carrying decades of strength. "Well, thank you," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "That's mighty kind of you." As he made his way to first class, the whispers in the cabin grew louder. A young mother leaned toward her daughter. "Did you see that?" she whispered. "That young man just gave up his first class seat for a veteran." A businessman raised an eyebrow. Never seen anything like that on a flight, he muttered. Barron slid into the now vacant economy seat, adjusting his long legs in the tighter space. He looked completely at ease, unfazed by the attention. A flight attendant passed by, discreetly asking, "Can I get you anything?" Barron simply shook his head, flipping his book open again. Meanwhile, in first class, the veteran settled into the plush leather seat, his expression softening. He adjusted the armrest, his hands trembling slightly as he took in the unexpected luxury. A flight attendant approached, offering him a warm blanket and a drink. The young man said, "You should have this seat," she explained, her voice kind. The veteran smiled faintly, his gaze distant. "It's been years since I've been treated like this," he murmured. He leaned back, looking toward the economy section where Barron was calmly reading his book. That small moment had changed everything. Outside, the plane gained speed on the runway, engines roaring as it prepared for takeoff. But no one on board realized this was just the beginning. The story was far from over. What had seemed like a simple act of kindness was about to take a turn no one could have predicted. The plane had reached cruising altitude, and the steady hum of the engines filled the cabin. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, offering drinks and snacks, but the atmosphere on Flight 247 felt anything but routine. Passengers stole glances between Barron Trump in economy and the elderly veteran in first class, the weight of the moment still hanging in the air. Whispers of admiration had spread, but something deeper was beginning to unfold. The veteran sat silently, gazing out the window, his weathered hands resting on his lap, the faintest tremor visible. His grip tightened slightly around his water cup, as if lost in thought. Then, as if the silence itself had become too heavy, he turned to the middle-aged woman seated next to him. "I have to say something," he murmured, his voice just loud enough to be heard. The woman, who had been flipping through a magazine, looked up, intrigued. She noticed the small pin on his lapel, a purple heart, and her interest deepened. The veteran exhaled, his gaze drifting toward the economy section where Barron sat, oblivious to what was happening. "That young man who gave me this seat," he said, voice steadying. "His family saved my life once." The woman blinked, her brows knitting together. "What do you mean?" she asked, her tone a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Nearby passengers, who had been subtly eavesdropping, leaned in a little closer. The veteran adjusted his posture as if preparing to relive something long buried. "It was decades ago," he began, his voice growing stronger. "During the Vietnam War, I was stationed overseas far from home. No family support." His jaw tensed as he revisited the past. "I was wounded, shot twice in the leg. By the time I made it back stateside, I had nothing. No direction, no purpose, no home." A shadow passed over his features, the kind that only a man who has seen too much could carry. "I ended up in New York, struggling to get by. No place to stay, barely enough money to eat." His voice faltered slightly, but he pressed on. "Then, one day, I met a man outside a diner. He didn't just toss me $1 and walk away, he sat down and listened." The woman's lips parted slightly, sensing where this was going. "That man was Fred Trump," the veteran revealed, his voice filled with reverence. A hush fell over first class. The name sent a ripple of recognition through the passengers listening in. The woman gasped softly, turning her full attention to the veteran. "Fred Trump," she repeated, as if needing confirmation. The veteran nodded, his eyes distant but resolute. "Yes, he didn't owe me a thing, but he gave me a roof over my head and a job to get back on my feet." His voice dropped slightly, thick with emotion. "He never asked for anything in return. Just told me, you served this country, it's the least we can do." By now, the entire first-class section had fallen silent, passengers barely breathing as they absorbed the revelation. The veteran's voice grew stronger. "I always wanted to thank his family, but life moved on and I never got the chance." His gaze flickered toward the back of the plane, where Barron Trump sat, unaware of the conversation unraveling around him. "And now today, that man's grandson just gave me a gift I will never forget." Passengers exchanged stunned glances, their expressions shifting from admiration to something almost surreal. If you find these stories inspiring and they motivate you to take action, please comment 9. If not, comment 0. Your feedback means a lot to us. Thank you for your valuable time. In economy, Barron sat completely unaware, his focus still on his book. But up in first class, the weight of the moment had settled over the passengers like a quiet storm. A flight attendant, visibly moved, leaned toward the veteran. "Would you like me to tell him what you just shared?" she asked gently. The veteran hesitated, then shook his head. "No, not yet," he said quietly. "Let the boy have his piece." He doesn't need to know, not right now, but the passengers couldn't contain their astonishment. A young mother holding a sleeping toddler spoke softly. My father always told me something similar, she whispered. He wasn't a veteran, but he believed that when someone lifts you up, even a little, you pass it on. It's like a chain reaction. What Barron did today proves that kindness still matters. A man across the aisle, in his 40s with tired but kind eyes, cleared his throat. My grandfather served in Vietnam, he said. He always told me that what got them through wasn't just their training, it was knowing that someone back home still cared. Hearing what Fred Trump did for you, that's rare. Too rare. The veteran nodded slowly, his lips curling into a faint smile. It's the little things, son, he said. People don't realize how far a small act of kindness can go. He exhaled deeply, shaking his head slightly. Back then, I thought my life was over. But that man's generosity gave me a second chance. The story spread like wildfire. A flight attendant, brushing away tears, spoke softly. My brother served in Iraq, she admitted. He didn't talk much about it, but when he came home, he told me something I'll never forget. He said that the small moments of kindness from strangers, those were the things that kept him going. The veteran turned to her, eyes full of understanding. Your brother's right, he murmured. And today I was reminded of that again. The hum of the engines remained steady as Flight 247 continued its journey. Yet inside the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted into something almost ethereal, as if the passengers were no longer just strangers on a plane, but witnesses to something far greater. The veteran's story had spread, weaving through the cabin like an invisible thread of kindness, gratitude, and fate. Some exchanged glances, others sat in quiet reflection, absorbing the sheer magnitude of the connection that had unfolded before them. In first class, the veteran sat with his hands folded, his expression a mixture of quiet pride and deep contemplation. He nodded slightly as if confirming something to himself, his mind drifting back to the years long past. Then, turning to the flight attendant, he said, I've always believed that gratitude doesn't just stop with the person who receives it, grows. His voice was steady, yet laced with emotion. He let out a slow breath, his eyes fixed on the seat where Barron Trump had once been. Fred Trump helped me rebuild my life. I've spent every day since then trying to honor that by helping others. And today, his grandson reminded me of that mission. He chuckled softly, shaking his head. Funny how life works, isn't it? Just then, the plane lurched slightly, hitting a patch of turbulence. A few passengers gripped their armrests, startled by the sudden movement. But as quickly as it came, the turbulence passed, and the cabin settled back into a strange, almost meditative silence. It was as if every soul in that plane had felt the weight of the moment and was now carrying a piece of it within themselves. In economy, Barron Trump finally noticed the quiet glances being cast in his direction. He looked up briefly from his book, catching the eyes of a woman across the aisle who smiled at him, a smile that held more meaning than he could yet understand. Barron offered a polite nod, then turned his attention back to the pages before him. He didn't yet know that his simple act of kindness had sparked a cascade of reflections and connections that no one on that flight could have predicted. As the plane began its descent, the murmured conversations in first class started to fade. The veteran stared out the window, lost in thought, his heart full in a way it hadn't been in years. Across the cabin, passengers exchanged knowing glances, some still marveling at the unusual turn of events. Then, just as the captain announced the final approach, the same flight attendant who had spoken with the veteran earlier walked purposefully toward the economy section. She stopped beside Barron's seat, kneeling slightly to meet his eye level. I wanted to let you know something, she said softly. Barron looked up from his book, his curiosity piqued. He slowly closed the cover, the title unreadable to those around him. Sure, he replied simply, his voice calm but intrigued. The flight attendant hesitated for a moment, as if searching for the right words. Years ago, she began, your grandfather, Fred Trump, helped that veteran when he was at his lowest point. Barron's expression remained composed, but a flicker of something recognition, understanding. Perhaps even awe passed through his eyes. He gave him a place to live and a job, she continued, expecting nothing in return. And today you did something for him that reminded him of that kindness. For a moment, Barron said nothing. His face remained neutral, but his eyes softened as though the weight of the revelation was settling over him. A connection that had begun decades ago had come full circle, and he was unknowingly a part of it. Finally, he exhaled, his voice quiet but firm. That's something, isn't it? The flight attendant smiled, nodding, it is. I thought you should know. The plane touched down smoothly on the Newark runway, but for many on board, this flight had already become a journey they would never forget. As passengers began unfastening their seatbelts and preparing to disembark, the veteran stood slowly, adjusting his jacket with careful precision. To everyone's surprise, instead of exiting with the first-class passengers, he turned and walked toward economy. His eyes scanned the rows until they landed on Barron Trump. Barron, now standing to retrieve his bag, looked up in surprise as the veteran stopped directly in front of him. For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of unspoken gratitude hanging in the air between them. Then, with a quiet but deeply respectful nod, the veteran extended his hand. "Young man," he said, his voice firm yet filled with warmth, "I wanted to thank you face to face. What you did today, it brought me full circle." The passengers around them fell silent, watching as this moment unfolded before them. Two generations connected not by blood, but by something even deeper: honor, kindness, and fate. "You come from a family of kindness," the veteran continued, his grip firm as he shook Barron's hand. "And today, you carried that forward. Never forget how much these moments matter." Barron held his gaze, his voice steady but quiet. "I didn't do anything special, sir. You deserved it." Around them, some passengers had tears in their eyes, others wore small, thoughtful smiles. It wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about something greater, a ripple effect of compassion that had transcended time. As passengers filed toward the exit, many stopped to thank Barron for his gesture. Others approached the veteran, offering handshakes and words of gratitude for his service. At the gate, the veteran turned one last time before leaving. He tipped his hat toward Barron, his eyes filled with an emotion words couldn't quite capture. "You've got a good heart, son. Don't ever lose that." Barron nodded, his usual reserved demeanor softening just enough to show the impact of the words. As he walked toward the baggage claim, he pulled out his phone, his fingers hovering over the screen for a moment before he typed a brief message. He hesitated, then hit send. Grandpa would have been proud of today. As the text disappeared into the digital ether, Barron took a deep breath, then slipped his phone back into his pocket. The world moved on, the airport bustled with its usual energy, but something had changed. This story wasn't just about a flight or a seat. It was about something far greater: the unseen bonds that tie us together, the power of kindness, and how the smallest gestures can leave a lasting mark on someone's heart. In a world often consumed by self-interest, where people rush through their days without a second thought, one act of selflessness reminded everyone aboard Flight 247 of a truth we often forget. Compassion is never wasted. It echoes. It multiplies. It changes lives. For many passengers, it was just another flight until it wasn't. In the span of a few hours, they witnessed something extraordinary. A young man, born into privilege, choosing to step aside so someone else could have a moment of comfort. He didn't do it for attention. He didn't do it for praise. He did it because it was the right thing to do. And that simple act of kindness, it wasn't just about giving up a seat. It was about acknowledgement, seeing a man, not just as an elderly veteran in a worn-out jacket, but as someone who had sacrificed for others, who had once needed help, and who had once received it from a stranger. Isn't that what we all long for? To be seen, to be valued, to know that in a world that moves too fast, someone is still willing to slow down, to reach out, to offer something, even if it's just a seat, a moment, a gesture that says, "You matter." This story teaches us that kindness has a ripple effect. The generosity of Fred Trump decades ago led to a life saved. That same life, in turn, went on to help others. And today his grandson, unknowingly, continued that legacy, proving that what we do, no matter how small, doesn't just stop with us. It lives on in ways we may never see. So ask yourself, how many lives could you touch with just one small act? A kind word, a listening ear, a moment of patience, a simple act of giving without expecting anything in return. These are the things that truly matter. For those on that plane, it was a moment they would carry forever. And maybe, just maybe, it was a reminder for all of us to be the kind of person who leaves a ripple of kindness wherever we go.